What's up, horror fans? It's Danny from the Lasercast, joined as always by Pete, and we are joined once again by our friend of the channel, the great David Darkness Weiner, the director of In Search of Darkness, Parts 1, Parts 2, Parts 3, and In Search of Tomorrow, the 80s maestro himself for all things genre. And he has turned his attention to the 1990s. We have a new documentary coming out, In Search of Darkness, 1990 to 1994. David, how are you? And why have we left the 80s behind and jumped into the 90s?
I am good, and it's great to be back with you guys. And well, I'll answer your question in that there was an absolute uh, cacophonous demand to go into at least another decade, if not very much. So many people want to go into the 90s. Um, the 90s in terms of horror was actually a very, very, very I think misunderstood time period. And when we look at it as a decade, I think a lot of people are like, well, yeah, Scream and Silence of the Lambs and Candyman, but then they kind of stop and they think and they're like, huh, what else? But if you're a true horror fan, that you really know that there's a lot of good stuff. And this is whether it's on the big screen or straight to video and your Friday night perusing the video store shelves, or whether it was a full moon entertainment or a trauma entertainment thing. Dr. Giggles, is that in? Have I seen that yet? Or are we talking about, Misery or Tremors or, Bram Stoker's Dracula or Natural Born Killers? There's just so many choices. And so obviously, listen, I'm going to become a human listicle, listing all sorts of things. So I'm warning you in advance. Once I get started, I'm like, don't forget this, don't forget this, don't forget this, don't forget that. But the idea is that a lot of people consider this the lost decade, at least the first half of the 90s. And because we're doing In Search of Darkness in two parts, the next decade, 1990 to 1994, and then we're going to do 95 and 99. The idea is we're going to really dial into this transition era where there was so much goodness from the 80s just spilling over into the 90s, your horror icons, Pinhead and Freddy and Chucky and so on. But there was a real grittiness and a real seismic shift in the way horror was presented, even by the major studios, calling them more thrillers, psychological thriller, erotic thriller, whatever you may call it. But also A-listers wanted to play monsters on the big screen, whether you're watching Tom Cruise in Interview with a Vampire or Jack Nicholson in Wolf. So there's a lot to chew on, pun kind of intended. And let's dive into it. Ask me questions before I just keep talking for an hour.
Well, I was gonna save this for later, but you brought up like the carryover effect, and what I noticed with a lot of the series, the franchises, was it feels like as we go into the 90s, there's this recognition that things have grown stale. And you look at a lot of the franchise entries, and they're completely bizarre. They go into these radical new directions. So you get like Army of Darkness, a pure comedy. You get Pet Cemetery 2, Return of the Living Dead 3, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Jason Goes to Hell. These are all tremendous departures from what we know of the franchises from the 80s. Why do you think that was? Why do you think these franchises go in these completely bizarro directions?
Well, first of all, if you want a franchise to maintain itself, you got to get super creative, right? And arguably, if you think about it, Child's Play was just getting started, with the first half of the decade with Child's Play 2 and 3. But Friday the 13th, Part 8 was in the 80s, and they're like, okay. Plus, Paramount, the whole franchise shifted into the hands from Paramount to New Line Cinema. So you have a new set of creative people looking at what can we do with this franchise that we can't call Friday the 13th anymore. Jason Goes to Hell. What the hell? Why not? How about space? We should do that. Save that for later. It's kind of that's in the pitch meeting. But I think, whether it was that or even the death of Freddy and Freddy's Dead, where they're just like, let's put the nail in the coffin of this franchise. Surprise, we'll come back in 3 years later with Wes Craven's new Nightmare. Darker, grittier, more meta version of Freddy. It's basically, I think a lot of people might look at these franchises as getting tired and weary, and boy, they do anything to keep your attention. Or you could look at it as, when you want to keep an established freight train moving, you got to get super duper creative when you're laying the tracks and do anything that you can. Listen, the Winchester house, they just kept on building. At a certain point, the Winchester Mystery House, look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. They couldn't stop building, so they stopped with the blueprints and they just kept on building. And there are doors leading out the second floor just to nothing. And you got to get creative with these things. I think that's pretty much essentially the answer. And I'll add one more thing to it, is that while a lot of people might have said, oh my God, it's franchise fatigue, I'm done with this stuff, there are plenty of us who are just like, boy, I never saw it in the theater, but here it is on the video shelf. I'll take any franchise because it's warm comfort food, for a horror fan. To be like, oh, I don't know, Puppet Master 3, 4, 5 to 29. Listen, we all know that it's going to be varying degrees of quality, but we all know what we're going to get. When you go to McDonald's, are you going to quality, or are you going to satiate yourself with comfort food so you just feel good and satisfied, and you feel like you've given yourself a temporary reward? Well, so many of these movies in the 90s, you knew what you were getting, and it was really tasty stuff.
And then sometimes in the 90s, you're going and you're getting your Szechuan sauce for your nuggets, and maybe you're trying the McRib. But that's the thing, David, is that like Danny and I have covered a lot of early 90s movies on this channel in recent months. We did Exorcist 3. I watched Jacob's Ladder and we talked about it together. We did People Under the Stairs. Yeah. So we've covered a lot of these early 90s movies. And one thing I keep saying in our discussions is how it feels like the aesthetic, the look of movies from the early 90s is very specific. And it seems like they have kind of a bleak feeling often. And they're kind of more extreme and a little bit more nihilist in the early 90s. And then also they just look really cool. There's a lot of like really great 90s movies where the visuals are just like off the hook. Like I mentioned Jacob's Ladder, I mentioned The Exorcist 3, thinking about Candyman. All these movies are just visually striking. Why do you think there's that theme and that the visual nature in these early 90s movies? Did it freeze?
We glitched there, but I think we're good.
Okay.
I think we're good. I got it. It glitched at the right time. I caught the whole thing.
Nice.
And so ultimately, I would say that actually in the mid 80s, this is going out on a limb, so follow where I'm going here. But 80s were very, and I'm not talking only about the horror movies, but just in general, the cinematography, moving from the 70s to the 80s, moved from sort of a grit and grainy feel to a much more glossy look. I mean, I'm talking about Adrian Lyne or 9.5 Weeks or Flashdance, things like this, where everyone wanted to make it like a pretty painting out of and turn whatever, Fatal Attraction, whatever you're talking about, into glossy art. Everything looked really great. And that was seeping into horror as well. The Hitcher is a beautiful Western that is just cinematography alone, whatever you think of the film itself, is fantastic. And so as you're getting into the 90s, people are recognizing in Hollywood that you can spend a good amount of your time to make things look really good. If someone like Catherine Bigelow could make Near Dark into something, a small little vampire Western, into something that looks visually stunning. They're just like, listen, we could actually devote an effort to making this look really good, despite what we may or may not feel about horror. So you're getting into the 90s now, and you have all these amazing cinematographers who are just like, I kind of want to do this too. I want to do my horror movie. I can make this look amazing. And the lesser known cinematographers are learning the tricks of the trade. And looking at it, doesn't matter what the genre is, you can make a pretty amazing film with just from cinematography alone. if you have the time and the budget, because I think just, a nutshell version of when you're talking about really good cinematography, good cinematography equals time to light it correctly. And most films, when you're making a film that takes 2 weeks to make, or a month to make or less, do not have time in the day when they need multiple setups to spend a lot of time on making a shot look pretty. And if you've ever been on a film set, it takes a very long time and a lot of patience to have an amazing shot. It's usually worth your while, but or you need that truck to wet down the streets, so everything's got that slick look that you got in the 80s moving into the 90s. Well, anyway, this is a very long answer in terms of the 90s really capitalized on that. And so whether it was a horror movie or horror adjacent thriller, or you just horror movie under the guise of the thriller, everything was dark, gritty, reflecting the change in music and grunge. Grunge was MTV always setting the tone for the look of movies, and movies would look to MTV, and it's kind of a snake eating itself after a certain point with the trendsetters of what people wanted to see. But there was a certain standard, and so the standard was much higher now. And I think also the standard of the content of the horror movies was getting a little more intellectual. There was still plenty check your brain at the door kind of content, but like you said, with Jacob's Ladder or People Under the Stairs, Misery, I won't become a laundry list of names, but there are so many where the filmmakers were respecting the audience to be capable of digesting a horror film with a smarter agenda. And the box office was speaking to that. And so more and more people were leaning into that. So you get a movie after Silence of the Lambs, like California with a K, we're ticking a number of boxes there. You're in the serial killer subgenre. It's in the wake of Silence of the Lambs. The cinematography is insane. You got A-listers like Brad Pitt, and Juliette Lewis, who is very freshly minted, from Cape Fear, and of course she's in Natural Born Killers as well. You've got so much going on, which, according to Hollywood, is the perfect package for a successful genre film.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you taking the time to explain that, because honestly, that's been something that's been on my mind for a while. And I was like, I really love this time period so much, And I was like, why? What makes it special? And I think you kind of literally explained it to me.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I thought it was a very long explanation, but I think what's interesting about In Search of Darkness 90 to 1994, if you've watched the trilogy celebrating the 80s, it's not film school, but I lean into a lot of filmmaking discussion. I went to film school. I'm a lover of film, and I think anyone who stops to dissect a movie rather than watch the movie itself is very interested in the behind the scenes tales and making of production stories,
Right.
So when it comes to the 90s, we're in a new era where there's a lot of established filmmaking, whether it's practical effects at their zenith or the infancy of CGI, but everyone wants to try it out, and they do, for better or for worse, and that's kind of the fun. I think also that's kind of the reason why people dismiss that era a lot more, because the CGI was not very good more often than not. Is that a reason to dismiss an entire film where the filmmakers were embracing a new technology and trying to stretch what they were capable of beyond practical effects, even though it's real clunky now? I argue that it's something to reassess,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You actually started to answer my next question before I answered it. Because
I'm the great Karnak. Your question is,
I feel like we beat the dead horse when all that the times that we talked about your 80s trilogy, about how important the video store was to the 80s kid. And I was going to transfer that to the idea of for people like Pete and my age who were born in the early 80s, we really did come around in the early 90s. And so, yeah, we did have the video store, but we also had this changing landscape of technology where our family started to get cable, and we started to get late night, like Monster Vision was suddenly a thing to watch. I know that I got into horror. One of my favorite things was Tales from the Crypt, which I know it started technically in '89, but I mean that's going right into the '90s.
Yeah, throughout the whole first half of the '90s.
Yeah.
Really.
You have like cable TV becoming an outlet for the young horror fan, and then you brought up the internet and like and the birth of really this infancy of CGI. I think of like I remember my dad took me to see Lawnmower Man in the theater, and my mind was blown. Like probably as much as my mind would be blown by how ridiculous it looks now, but like again, to put yourself into the mindset of like that early '90s kid watching this new technology, having these new outlets to horror, like how do you think that translates from like the video stores of the '80s to suddenly the staying up late to watch like the cable late night cable horror movie, or like the HBO horror movies now, for the early '90s kid, and the new tech, like if you want to go into more detail about like the new CGI and the new tech that was around the internet and so on.
I always use this is sort of bouncing around a bit, but I always use Jar Jar Binks as a touchstone for what's great and what's terrible. And that I say that in that I was properly educated by someone who's a kid when they saw Phantom Menace, and she said, I've been defending myself my whole life, saying there's nothing wrong with Jar Jar Binks. He made me laugh. And she was a kid, and she went to go see the new Star Wars movie, and she was enthralled and entertained, and that was that. You know, us older folks who kind of knew better or felt like our childhood was destroyed by Jar Jar Binks, you have to remember that there's a whole younger generation seeing all this stuff for the first time. All these stories are new, whether they've been told 1,000 times or not. So for you watching Lawnmower Man for the first time, you know, Lawnmower Man is kind of like it's like low-hanging fruit for, CGI was real bad around that time. But if you rewatch that movie, they're diving into a whole brand new technology that was brand new and cutting edge, and they showed it. They showed what it's like going into virtual reality, and they turned a Stephen King movie about a giant guy who gets naked and eats grass, and he's a lawnmower man, into a guy who runs a lawnmower and becomes, you know, incredibly super intelligent and strong based on, you know, forbidden technology, you know, grabbing that apple, so to speak. But my point is that at the time, if you were young, that was insane and amazing. And sure, it does not age well, but arguably, if you look back at, you know, Ray Harryhausen, who is the greatest, you know, you look at my favorite from the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and you look at the Cyclops, and you look at stop motion animation, it's indeed clunky, but no one dismisses it as, well, that sucks. You're like, no, that's the best that they had at the time period. And in the context of the movie that they were watching and we are watching now, it completely works. And it tells the story, and it's either dated yet charming, or it's clunky, or it's spectacular. Like, say, you know, to this day, Ray Harryhausen's, you know, Medusa sequence in Clash of the Titans still gets you every time. You know, it's bravura performance from a stop motion miniature armature puppet. That being said, at the time, I could just go on for hours on this, but at the time, like morphing, it was even before we even called it CGI, we called it morphing, you know? And so, you know, the first time we're seeing any CG other than, say, young Sherlock Holmes, you know, in the mid 80s with the stained glass night, you know, during a fever dream, you pretty much have the abyss, and you have the waterworm of the abyss, and you know, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio touching the face, and it's just water, yet it's reflecting her expressions, and we'd never seen anything like that. Cut to moments later, it seems, from James Cameron, another Terminator movie, and now all of a sudden you have the T-1000 from liquid metal morphing into weapons and all sorts of things believably there. Again, a mix of practical effects and CGI effects, but so deftly done, you don't sometimes know where the practical effects end and the CGI begins. So, for example, just to belabor the point, I had no idea when I watched that because I'm like, oh, I'm watching morphing. I'm watching morphing. How cool. Well, when Jeanette Goldstein kills the spoiler alert, kills the father, with the milk jug, and you see that happen and it comes back into a hand. Well, you see it happen, and that's using both practical effects and CG, because it's a practical effect when she's literally got the arm attached to his face. But then when it comes back, it's CG. You don't know where it ends, where it begins.
Yeah.
When you're shooting the T-1000 in the grand finale, and he splits over in all different ways like this, and then he comes together. Well, when he's like this, that's a Stan Winston practical effect. But you don't know where that begins or where that ends. And Jurassic Park, you don't know where the real dinos begin, the Stan Winston practical life-size ones, and end. The only scene I ever could tell was in the Brachiosauruses in the beginning. I'm like, okay, that's cool, but I could tell they're CG.
Yeah.
The rest, even to this day, I'm in full tangent land. But what people ultimately saw, the filmmakers at the time, was they said they saw morphing, so Mick Jackson, next thing you know, Mick Garris, there's another director named Mick Jackson. Mick Garris, whether it's in The Stand or with Sleepwalkers, he's going wonderfully morph crazy,
Yes.
Directors, Hellraiser 3, Hellraiser, Massacre in a club, he comes out in full CG before he becomes, full.
Yeah.
I can give 1,000. The Trickster. Everyone wanted
In
it.
Brain Scan, right?
Right.
It's funny because I just saw, I was at New York Comic Con and John Carpenter was there, and they did a spotlight panel with him, and he took questions from the crowd, and somebody asked John Carpenter about like practical effects, obviously he, from The Thing and everything, and then tried to make a connection to like how bad The Thing 2011 was. And Carpenter even said, look, CGI is a tool that we use, and it's just a matter of how you use the tool. And it's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, it's a thing that we can use if we have the money and the time. And I thought that was like, I think like a lot of people expect like somebody like John Carpenter to just be like, boo CGI, and for him to like kind of come out and be like, nah, if it works, it works.
The best CG is arguably a period piece or a non-monster creature film, because there's CG everywhere now, and you don't even know it.
Yeah.
It's the ones where you're looking dead on at Gollum or what have you, and you're picking it apart because it's not real. So you're like, is this real or not? Ultimately, these days, practical effects are still used quite a bit, but they use CGI to sweeten little elements. I remember I had a great conversation with Mike Doherty talking about Krampus, and he singled out to me, well, all these creatures, they're all practical, and you sweeten a little bit, so a little facial expression. You're hiding wires, you're hiding people, you're moving things just a little more, so there's a little more range in their motion and their expressions, but you still have a physical object there with movement and animatronic. And if I've so given in to CG at this point that because I used to be quite against it because it would take me out of the story. That was the only reason. If it kept me enthralled, I didn't care whether it was CG or not. But if it was so obviously CG and it took me out, then I had an issue with it. These days, it relentlessly has beat me into a pulp, and I worship my CG masters now.
Well, I mean, we're in tangent land, but I think Danny actually had a question about erotic thrillers.
Oh, well,
the bread and butter of Skinamax in the late 80s and early 90s, right?
No pun intended, but you touched on this a little bit earlier. you use the phrase horror adjacent, and I feel like, and I've always felt this way, my favorite horror movie of all time is Jaws, and I can't tell you how many times I say, oh, my favorite horror movie is Jaws, and I hear that's not a horror movie. And so when I saw in your like in the list of like themes for this documentary 90 to 94, that you're going to cover both like the erotic thriller subgenre, but also like you mentioned natural born killers and movies like crime thrillers. The biggest one, of course, being Silence of the Lambs. It swept the Oscars. Why is it just the fact that like studios became afraid to use the word horror, or is there something more to the idea that like we had to invent terms for horror movies in the early 90s?
Well, why do we call things elevated horror now instead of horror? Well, because a larger population that is turned off by horror as a genre will say elevated. Oh, whoa, wait, maybe that's for me. You know, it's smarter than the dumb horror that I'm just not into. That's just a bunch of slasher stuff. You know, the perception of people who are not in the fold, like us, who really get it, you've got to entice them. Listen, these are $1 million movies. And so, listen, you know, what is it? I'm going to get the saying wrong, you know, but you know, if it's a duck, if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's a duck, you know. So fundamentally, there were so many. There was such preponderance of slashers and straight to video stuff in the '80s, and the '80s horror tidal wave was just so massive. I think there was a certain amount of fatigue, and filmmakers they knew horror does well, but they wanted to appeal to a broader, more erudite audience. And so they thought, let's just change it up a little bit. You know, we'll call Hand That Rocks the Cradle a thriller, you know, psychological thrillers, erotic thrillers, Hands That Rock the Cradle, Sleeping with the Enemy, you know, Single White Female, Pacific Heights, you know, Copycat, all these movies about killers or serial killers or stalkers. Fundamentally, if this was happening to you, absolute horror. If there are people dying around you because of some problem that is, you know, constructed in these stories, absolutely terrifying. So why can't we call it horror? And I think fundamentally we're all drawn to these stories because of the what if scenario. What would I do in a situation like that? You know, whether it's Jaws or whether it is, you know, Single White Female. We've all either struggled to dip our toe in the pool because we knew a shark was going to get us, or we had a roommate that we weren't quite comfortable with. You know, it all is part and parcel of the stuff that we experience on a daily basis. But there was a seismic shift of filmmaking with a lot more thriller elements that they could just call a thriller. Whatever you wanted to do when you're eating that, again, it's digestible as horror for you. But I think that was just the best way that they could sell a lot more stuff without pigeonholing it in a category that they didn't think would be appealing to the largest amount of people.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you brought up that like horror does well. And I was thinking like maybe it was at the late 80s, early 90s that horror might have taken a slight downturn in like box office. Maybe that had to do with it because, you know, you brought up elevated horror, but then like you look at like Halloween 2018 makes hundreds of millions of dollars and you're like, that's as slasher gets.
Well, so, you know, it's the age old, there's the people who are in the club and in the know, and then there's the people who are following box office spikes who want to write an article for Vulture. You know, I don't put down Vulture. I love Vulture, but it's sort of like there's Fangoria and then there's everything else, you know, Famous Monsters and everything else, you know. So horror fans show up first weekend because they want to see it, whether it's bad, good, or in between. They want to be able to say that they saw it and made their own decision for it.
Yeah.
The rest of the world who's on the fence, they need these elements to get them in the theater. you know? And so if horror's back, you know, if it takes a Terrifier 2 to shock people to say, wow, out of all things, that movie is making a lot of money, it doesn't matter whether you're Ari Aster or, you know, going back to the 90s and the early 90s, box office was constantly strong for horror. But there was also, because there were these growing franchises, and there was the lucrative lure of making a small movie and having it go direct to video and making a huge amount of money and saving money, which costs millions to market and promote a film. If you could just bypass that and put up a couple of standees and have Blockbuster across the nation buy your House 4, you don't have to put it in the theater. You don't have to pay for, you know, newspaper ads, which are incredibly expensive, and, you know, TV ads and all that kind of stuff like that. And you could make a mint. And if you don't care about the prestige of saying that it was in the theater, by that point, people were just like, what? More. What else are you making? You made another Hellraiser. Great. That's awesome. What's the next one? I can't wait for the next one. You know, people are ravenous for this stuff. And
Full Moon was Full Moon. I know you brought up. I'm sorry. I know you brought up Full Moon before, but they were like the kings of this. Like, I wanted to watch Doll Man, and then I watched Demonic Toys, and then I was like, oh my God, there's a Doll Man versus Demonic Toys.
Two great tastes in one candy bar.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
You know, it's funny. We were talking about horror and just like how prevalent it was, especially like on VHS and stuff. But one of the things that excited me the most about your trailer was that we see a lot of horror on television in your trailer too. And, you know, there's this moment with the early 90s where you had on ABC, you have all these Stephen King miniseries. And that's really my introduction to Stephen King, is through the It miniseries, The Stand, which you show in your trailer. And then right around that same time, you also have Twin Peaks. And boy, what a time to just be a kid and like kind of watching TV over my mother's shoulder or something, you know, in the living room. And this stuff is on there, you know? And so, I mean, that's just basically my little segue to say, have you interviewed David Lynch for this one?
Yeah, absolutely. David Lynch, he's actually in the other room and he's making his coffee. And he's doing
perfect. Okay.
a weather report, so I don't want to interrupt him. But
does that other room have red curtains by any chance?
Yeah, it's got a black and white zigzag floor. I don't know. It's kind of, every time I go in there, I lose all sense of space and time, and I come out with a little dancing man chewing gum. It's really odd. But imagine a generation of kids who are too young to watch Twin Peaks, watching Twin Peaks, because their parents are watching it, and right. the cha-ching of therapy in the you know succeeding years, from seeing, you know, Killer Bob, you know, crawling towards you in your living room. So many. It just that TV show, which actually brought a prequel film, you know, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, changed. It was a game changer. It was an absolute game changer. It was a disruptor for television. People saw that and they immediately were like, that can be done. You're allowed to do that. You right. know, so many TV shows just afterwards. While Oliver Stone's was producing Wild Palms. There were all sorts of these shows that wanted to be, or if not just like Twin Peaks, they wanted to get that vibe and ride the zeitgeist that it was riding. But there were so many other elements on television. Files. I know we kind of have a glitchy connection, so we got all that right.
Did you say X-Files?
You said X-Files, yeah.
Yeah, so we got the X-Files. You know, there were so many. What's important for me is In Search of Darkness trilogy was all TV. Was all the In Search of Darkness 80s trilogy was all movies. Now that we're going into the 90s, I really wanted to include television. You can't do it all because there's so much going on. But I just thought I can cherry pick a couple things. And Stephen King miniseries were really the catalyst, because I really thought to myself, you can't do the 90s without Pennywise and It, the miniseries. And that was on television. So how can I integrate that and make it all make sense? And I just thought, well, the only reason I'm not doing television also is just because there's so much and there's too much. But you know what? Why not? Let's do it, And so I'm interested in the gateway horror as well. So, Tales from the Crypt, but you also had, the Tales from the Crypt Keeper on Saturday morning cartoons, Kids watch in the 90s grew up watching Erie, Indiana. Are You Afraid of the Dark? Goosebumps a little later, and reading R.L. Stine. R.L. Stine was the Stephen King for tweens and teens and stuff like that. Point being, between that and Twin Peaks and all these Stephen King miniseries that go on to, like, sometimes they come back, and the Tommy Knockers. I mean, you name it, they just kept on going throughout the 90s.
Yeah.
And on the big screen too, you got Graveyard Shift, you got Needful Things and Misery. It just keeps on going and going. Stephen King was an absolute factory. There you go.
I love that movie so much. It's so
good. And so ultimately, I believe, and like you said, whether it's Monster Vision or whether you're watching, Friday the 13th, the TV show, which, sort of had tailed off in the early 90s, but started in the late 80s, or Freddy's Nightmares?
Freddy's Nightmares.
Yeah, by the time the 90s were 90ing, horror was everywhere. Gateway horror was everywhere. Television wanted a piece of what was going on. Anthology stories, whether they were in the theater, whether it was, Tales from the Hood or Tales from the Dark Side, all this stuff was either in the theaters, but also companions. You remember, Tales from the Dark Side was in the 80s, and they got their film in the early 90s. My point is, television, the small screen, whether you rented it at the video store or whether it was broadcast on network television or cable, it was everywhere. And Monster Kids were feeding like a frenzy off of anything that they were allowed to watch, or what they snuck on television. Parents weren't around. So in the theaters or the small screen, this was our world. And that's what we're here to talk about in this movie.
I speaking of somebody who got their start really in the early 90s, and I've watched the trailer now like 6 different times, and I'm 99.9% sure I saw some of his early work in there. Guillermo del Toro. You're a
good eye.
You're a famous famous Monsters of Filmland guy. There's no bigger monster lover than Guillermo del Toro, and he really, he's now a friggin' Oscar-winning director who continues in the genre. What did he like? I know you had to have covered Kronos, maybe Devil's Backbone also. So I would love to know if you got to interview him, but what was it like getting into his movies, and are there any other foreign filmmakers and foreign films included in this? Because I love foreign films so much, and I know you covered a bunch in your 80s horror films.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the cast of talking heads that are going to be in Search of Darkness 90s, we've made a very difficult decision not to announce anybody because of the SAG and the writer's strike. And in solidarity with WGA, SAG, AFTRA, even though the Writers Guild have come to their agreement, SAG is still going on as we speak while we're talking. So they cannot talk. All of the actors cannot talk about not only their current work, but they can't talk about work from 30 years ago. It's all struck work, and so in solidarity, we can't announce anyone. And so we are known for shouting from the rooftops all the great people that we've got when we've got a new film, and that will happen as soon as we're able to do it. That being said, Guillermo del Toro, of course, he's top of the wish list of having talking about Kronos and Devil's Backbone. Later in the 90s, he did Mimic. What's interesting is that, you have people like him. You have Peter Jackson, doing Dead Alive. And of course, he did Meet the Feebles, and he did, gosh, I always stumble because I want to say Brain Dead. Bad Taste. Frighteners, of course. There was new talent that was emerging. Even M. Night Shyamalan is in the '90s, and you got. Well, I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself because I don't want to talk about the second half. But the names that are common now, David Fincher, in relation to horror or genre work, David Fincher, very notable in the '90s for Alien 3 and Fight Club and Seven, very specifically. And insane music videos, which got him his start. We definitely want to go international. Shinya Tsukamoto has this movie called Haruko. That's look it up. It's nuts. It's a Japanese film, absolutely nuts and worthy. These are the kinds of things that we want to include. Let me answer your question this way. And in Search of Darkness 1, we did the heavy hitters. Search of Darkness 2, we started going international. And Search of Darkness 3, we continued domestic, international, and straight to video, shot on video, the ultimate smorgasbord by the time we got to part 3. This time around, I'm giving it a much more even playing field to the much more eclectic stuff. My biggest problem, which is a good problem to have, is how do I fit it all? Because I can't. So whether you've got, Bram Stoker's Dracula in one year and you have some weird, an Argento film, I want to be able to include both ends of the spectrum. Something's going to not be able to fit at a certain point, especially if I want to include elements of television and how that works. I'm working on it. I don't want to reveal anything. But more of what everyone wants based on making 3 whole movies where people said, this is great, but could you do this? This is great. Do more of that. Now I know what you guys want and I know what I want based on what you guys want.
There's a scene in the trailer where there's like an octopus of some kind.
You have to look it up. I'll tell you this.
Okay.
Look at the end of the trailer. Everyone go to 90shorrordoc.com, 90s, 90shorrordoc.com, and go watch this insane, amazing, wonderful trailer that Paul Konshake on our team made. Chris Stratton did all the insane graphics that look amazing. And Robin Block and I worked with those guys to make what we think is just a kick-ass trailer that's going to remind everybody, like, oh my God, that was in that? I never even seen that. What the heck was that? Oh yeah. Oh my God. It's just going to reinforce what you knew and then go way beyond the lines and say, what the heck was that? What the heck was that? If you look at the very end, the last frame of the entire trailer, there's a whole list of everything. I think we have 88 different movies that we jump from movie to movie to movie. And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Your trailer, just to reinforce this, 90shorrordoc.com, your trailer starts with George Bush. President George Bush is the first
George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yes.
First
George,
Bush. Just to clarify for those that might even forget that there were 2 George Bushes.
And I this was a big part of your 80s documentaries also, was like the politics of the 80s and how that influenced the horror and the films that were coming out. And so you start your trailer with Bush, you make reference to OJ, and I was also thinking of like the LA riots, a major event of the early 90s. Was there the war in Iraq, of course, was there a specific political thing that you noticed for the early 90s that geared your like filmmaking documentary style?
Say the last part over, because I know Pete's going back and forth with the glitch there. Just tell me the tail end of your question again.
Was there a specific political situation, or was there something politics wise for the early 90s that guided your decision making in the process of choosing films or something that you wanted to focus on as like a political aspect of that early 90s period?
I think it's a good question. And as we all know, at least those of us who pay attention to the genre, horror film is a wonderful and terrible reflection of daily life. You know, the socio-political elements that we experience on our daily life, the pop culture that we experience on our daily life, just the moral fables that play out on the news every single night is reflected in the films. And so, you know, we talked earlier about the grittiness of a lot of these films, you know, and you mentioned you got to show your shirt again, People Under the Stairs.
Oh,
You know, that's something that is, you know, where Wes Craven is concerned. He really wants to reflect, you know, between like that movie and say Candyman, you've got a reflection of the urban blight going on. You know, that was the time where like South Central LA, everybody thought life was like Boys in the Hood, and they weren't entirely wrong. The greed is good, corporate raider, Reaganomics of the 80s spilled over into the early 90s, where the people at the top echelon were getting their just desserts, but there was a hangover from these corporate raiders and Wall Street ultimately rewarding the top 1%. The trickle down economics that Reagan promised were not trickling down, and people were really feeling the pinch. And the spark of it all kind of culminated with Rodney King and the LA riots. And around that time, you know, whether you're talking about, you know, Candyman, of course, it's in Chicago, People Under the Stairs, they're reflections of what's going on at the time. You know, there is a revolt. The people are are not content with the way things are and their economic status. That's an age-old story. It's not new for the early 90s. You know, decades in all different countries. There's discontent and then there's revolt. But we saw it clear as day on the news and on CNN, whether it was the OJ slow chase or the LA riots, which I lived in Los Angeles at the time. So I was there for it. And, you know, anyone who turned on the TV and saw the flashpoint at Florence and Normandy and Reginald Denny being pulled out of his truck and having the crap beat out of him just because of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, will know that this was there was a turning point here. Something had to give. Something had to change. Things have not changed for the better since. They might have appeared to have, but if you look at where we are today, I'm not going to get on a whole political soapbox, but
no, but
we
like
all know
you can draw a clear line from Rodney King to George Floyd. I mean, you don't have to get political. That shouldn't be a political thing. I mean, and then like we get movies today like Get Out because of that, or because of situations like that.
I'll just say this lastly about these elements are very important. This is not a political film, just like 80s, you know, In Search of Darkness 80s was not political. But you have to touch upon these things to give proper context and set the stage. And it was very important in this trailer for me to set the stage of the time, to include George Bush and Kuwait and the, you know, Desert Storm, to include the riots, to include OJ and reality television, and MTV and the influence of MTV and Blockbuster Video and Katie Couric saying, "What's this internet?" and then dial up. You know, that to me is fun because that was all new then. It was all brand new and everyone were trying to wrap their heads around it. And that creates the context of what was going on in just an infinitesimal way, just to give you a taste of why the films were ultimately the way they were, whether they were political or completely the opposite and just full-on entertainment and recapturing the classic monsters of our youth, like, you know, Wolf and Dracula and, you know, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and, you know, Interview with the Vampire and so on. You know, even Roger Corman's Frankenstein Unbound, you know, going back to the classics, because sometimes, you got to rebound off of the stuff where you need your escape, you know, and that's what horror is to many. It doesn't have to be some instructional guide. It's either on the surface, you know, like you know, Oliver Stone doing Natural Born Killers, or it's a subtext, and you either enjoy the ride or you recognize that there's a bigger story to tell, but it's not beating you over the head with it.
Yeah, I like you bring up Natural Born Killers, and that movie even just feels like a commentary on what news was becoming, with like entertainment news turning real stories into like entertainment. And you watch Mickey and Mallory, they're killing for fun, and you can, again, you can draw almost a line from they're killing to be famous and do it on TV, and you could draw a line to mass shooters who, you know, want to get their names out there. And it just shows that horror is kind of not just cyclical but linear, and it just
you could look at the talk shows of the day, you know, and I'm not talking about like Donahue and Oprah, you know, but then you're getting, you know, talking about Jerry Springer, which is, you know, or Morton Downey Jr. before Jerry Springer, if anyone wants to look that one up. I'm all about dated references now. You got to either have been there or look it up, and you'll be kind of amazed. But that was like the seed and spark for so many outrageous, you know, reality show experiences. And this was in a talk show environment, but this was a bunch of people who were rewarded for doing, you know, morally and ethically questionable things. They get a soapbox to parade it, and people clapped because they wanted more, more. It's really bad. That I want that more. You know, you got Geraldo, and next thing you know, you have the KKK on TV, and everyone's having this all-out brawl, you know, throwing chairs at each other, and that got satirized in movies because it was just so iconically outrageous and horrible at the same time. But guess what? People looked at that, they saw the ratings, and they said, I want more. And so a lot of this stuff feeds into fears and perceptions of what real life was going to be affected by in terms of this stuff. But at the same time, movies were just like, and television were just like, give the people what they want. There's a Kinks album that I love. It's called Give the People What They Want. And if you listen to that song, that explains it all. You know, it just doesn't matter how grotesque and gory and depraved it gets. If the ratings are high, give them more.
Yeah. I don't know where Pete is, but
David,
it's been.
Pete said that his connection froze. And he said, carry on. And then it's just the two of us now.
That's fine. Listen, we've loved having you on again, and I want to give you a chance to really plug the hell out of your newest documentary. We've loved all three of the In Search of Darkness films. We loved In Search of Tomorrow. So tell everybody again, 90shorrordoc.com, and what can they do when they go there to pre-order and everything?
Yeah, 90shorrordoc.com. All our socials, just by the way, are 80s Horror Doc. We didn't change the socials to 90s Horror Doc. It's 80s Horror Doc all across, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, even TikTok now. You change it over, people can't find you. So we stuck with what we have, which is a wonderful audience. But go into 90shorrordoc.com. It explains everything that you get. This is a pre-order, but what's cool is we have a whole year of activities, Q&As, watch parties. Like I said, you know, when we are allowed to announce and we have the cast ready to declare, you guys will be the first to hear it if you follow, if you're a backer of our pre-sale for this film. It's not a Kickstarter, so just go to 90shorrordoc.com. But we got Q&As. We're going to have Q&As with 90s horror icons and legends, as well as just us nerding out like you guys do every week, just talking about all this kind of stuff that we love, and we love to dissect, and we love to talk about ad nauseum in the best way possible, you know?
Yeah.
I also want to say though that and you know, just you check 90s Horror Doc for all the cool things. We're, as always, we do things like you get your name in the credits. You know, 2 super cool posters, like the ones behind me by Clayton Benge and Dave Morrell. Amazing art. We got a patch this time, a sew on patch with the In Search of Darkness logo. All sorts of cool, good stuff. You get your physical copy, you've got your digital copy, you've got the soundtrack. We make it worth your while, but we also want to give you not a order it and then have to wait a year to hear from us again. We want to keep involved with you guys. We want to hear from you guys. We want to have you help shape our documentary, much like this past summer. You guys were awesome in terms of cheerleading the survey and sharing what you want and telling people to get, you know, getting the word out to tell people to participate and let me know. So I'm not working in a vacuum. I really welcome. Oh, are you going to do this movie? I'd love for you to do this movie because of X, Y, or Z. You know, that's how Trickster of BrainScan got on my radar. I knew BrainScan, but I had no clue. People, because you never hear when people talk about, oh, 90s icons, you've got Leprechaun, you've got Candyman, you got Pennywise. No one ever says Trickster, but
I got into that movie because Terminator 2 at that moment in time was my favorite movie of all time, and I wanted to see the next Eddie Furlong movie.
Right. So between that and Pet Sematary, you were a happy camper, right?
Yeah.
I also want to say, lastly, that physical media is a very important thing.
I know.
The 80s trilogy, In Search of Darkness, we're re-releasing it. So this whole campaign for In Search of Darkness 90s, it's a campaign that only goes until October 31st. So between now and October 31st, you have to go to 90shorrordoc.com. But once you're on there, you can also independently get the In Search of Darkness trilogy as a physical edition as one it'll be the 3 discs, but it's one not container. It's one, what do you call it? I'm having a moment here.
A DVD, Blu-ray?
It's a Blu-ray shell, but it's got the layers of all 3. It's going to have new art. It's going to have a new booklet. But a lot of people, because it's spooky season, are going to Shudder saying, I see In Search of Darkness 2 and 3. That's awesome. But where's In Search of Darkness 1? And people like you, Dan, just say, well, it's on my shelf because I have the physical copy.
Yeah.
So people who don't have the physical copy and realize that streaming is fleeting and physical is forever, you can order In Search of Darkness trilogy 80s, and you can get it right away. In terms of we're got to make In Search of Darkness 90s, but you'll get your In Search of Darkness trilogy before Christmas. It'll be turned around right after this October 31st. So that's my endless amounts of plugs.
No, I mean, not to belabor the point, but physical media is so important now. We just got word that, I think it was Best Buy and Amazon, and not Amazon, but Best Buy and Walmart are going to stop doing physical.
Oh, I didn't hear about the Walmart part. I saw the Best Buy one.
Well, it was Best Buy, and it was another store, another big type store, but
I'll look for it. I won't hold you to the Walmart.
It's just so disappointing, and I do love, obviously I'm in my bedroom now, but in my living room I have my In Search of little set of the trilogy and Tomorrow there. If you're a horror fan, it's so worth the money. Not to be shameless, but it really is, because aside from the fact that the documentaries are over 4 hours, so it's not like you're
right.
paying. It's not like you're paying a little bit of money to get a 90-minute thing. You're getting 4+ hours worth of stuff, and yeah, it's awesome. And we appreciate all the work that you do and everything. So,
well,
it was great to be back, David. It really was.
You, Dan, you and Pete have been amazing supporters, and it's greatly appreciated by me and Creator VC. We recognize the fact that you just love this stuff, and it comes from your heart, and people can, they can suss out whether you're genuine or not in a New York minute.
Yeah.
and that's what's so important. And that's why I'm always happy to come and chat with you guys, because you really care, you really love this stuff, and you could talk intelligently and knowledgeably about this stuff. And so I thank you for always, helping us shout it out from the rooftops. And, well, I'll ask you before we go, what's your spooky, what's on your DVD player for spooky season?
So I'm shocked at how much I enjoyed the new Goosebumps on Hulu. Really enjoyed that. Because of New York Comic Con, I have been on a delay. I have not been able to watch The Fall of the House of Usher, Mike Flanagan's newest series.
Yeah.
So that is going to be like first and foremost. In terms of movies, the most insanely dark and disturbing film I've seen in a very long time, I just saw at the movie theater, is When Evil Lurks.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's by the director of Terrified, which is
Uh-huh.
also on Shudder, Argentinian film. Holy crap, that was great. But yeah, the next thing on my list is definitely going to be the Fall of the House of Usher. And in terms of 90s, like I said, I always have I'm going to rewatch Graveyard Shift. I'm going to rewatch. I'm going to try to get Charlotte, my daughter, to watch a few more of the movies that we saw in your trailer, because like you mentioned, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I don't think gets any credit. And I think it's a really great, I think it's one of the most accurate versions, especially taking from the book. I think De Niro is fantastic as the monster. I think it's so underrated. So I might show her that. Dead Alive, of course.
Is she prepared for that? Is she ready for that?
She's seen far worse, I think. You mentioned In the Mouth of Madness earlier, and John Carpenter, like I said, he was at Comic-Con. His wife and they do Storm King Comics, and they had one of the giant puppets from In the Mouth of Madness there. That I took a picture of. I have a picture of my daughter in front of it, and they had all the Sutter Kane books too, which was awesome.
One of the fun things, a quick side anecdote about that, when I interviewed John Carpenter for In Search of Darkness at his production office, he has bits and pieces on his mantle and awards and things like that, but sitting in the corner from In the Mouth of Madness is oh boy, now I'm going to forget her name, but the sort of librarian-y kind of older woman who has like a Lovecraftian. She's got all the
the woman who was in The Wedding Singer.
Yeah, she's in everything. She's that character actor. You're like, oh, I know you from somewhere.
And she becomes the tentacle monster.
Yep. Yeah. And that's just sitting there, grabbing my attention while I'm trying to listen. It's not hard to not look at John Carpenter when you're talking with John Carpenter. Of course, that's where all your attention is. But every time I had that moment where I'm like, all right, what's my next question? I'd look in a side eye this creature in the corner. I'm like, that
was the Pickman Hotel.
Yes, exactly. Very, very cool. Very, very cool. Well, I've got my pumpkin for Halloween. I can't do the thing there. I'm holding my little pumpkin now. There we go. And anyway, spooky season is a big deal for us at where I live in California. And hey, it's good stuff, Although I'm in the mood to watch this one again.
Oh yes,
Amityville Horror. I'm kind of on an Amityville Horror kick. And so I'm going through the book again. It was big when I was a kid, and the movie is super fun too. And the later movies, there are a couple Amityvilles in the 90s too. Straight to video that may or may not be craptastic, but that's all the point, right?
There were a bunch of franchises like what was it Witchcraft or Witchboard that they made like 15 of them, and every cover was like Julie Strain half naked. like as a vampire. I don't even remember. I just like remember being distracted by those boxes when I was like 11.
We were
So-
all distracted. That's part of the story, how much we were distracted by those boxes, and those particular elements were always sort of the deciding factor to whether or not we wanted to take a chance on an unknown title with our $2, you know?
Yeah. Well, Dave, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate the conversation. And anytime you want to come back and promote, when the strike is over, if you want to come back and just shout a list of names, we'll have you on to shout a list of names.
Oh, very cool.
And that would be awesome. So can't wait for the new documentary In Search of Darkness, 1990 to 94.
Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it.